Sometime around 100,000 years ago, something happened that changed everything. A person died. That's not the unusual part. Death was everywhere back then. Animals left their dead where they fell. Predators stripped the bones clean. Wind and rain did the rest. That was the normal way of things. But these people did something different. They dug a hole in the ground, they placed the body inside, they covered it with red powder, and then they buried it. Why? No one taught them to do this. There was no manual, no priest, no tradition handed down from anyone. So what made them pick up that first handful of dirt and think, this person deserves more? Before we get to the burials themselves, we need to understand something. Burial requires a very specific cognitive ability. You have to understand that death is permanent. You have to understand that it will eventually happen to you. That's not an obvious thought. That's not an automatic thought. It's a staggering intellectual achievement to look at a body and understand what it means for your own future. Most animals never make this connection. Only we did. The oldest confirmed burial site on Earth is a cave in Morocco called Contrabandiers. Inside, archaeologists found the remains of a child. The bones were arranged deliberately, buried around 78,000 years ago. But here's where it gets complicated. That's not even the oldest candidate. In South Africa, a cave called Border Cave holds the remains of a child buried with a seashell. The shell had been deliberately pierced. It wasn't food. It wasn't random. Someone chose to put it there. That burial dates back nearly 74,000 years. Think about that. 74,000 years ago, someone thought a dead child deserved a necklace. In Israel, a cave called Kafze contains at least 12 deliberately buried individuals. 10 of them are children. Several were buried with tools and animal bones left alongside them. One teenager was laid out with deer antlers placed carefully across the body. Not thrown in, placed. That single word changes everything. Because placing something requires intention. It requires thought about the person who died. It requires the belief that this somehow matters. That the body is still worth something even when the person is gone. And here's the part that most people miss. These weren't modern people in any cultural sense. They didn't have writing. They didn't have cities. They didn't have organized religion as we understand it. And yet they buried their dead. Deliberately. Carefully. Sometimes with grave goods. Sometimes with red ochre pigment coating the body. Sometimes with nothing at all except the care of the arrangement. Let's go back to the ochre for a moment, because it keeps appearing in the evidence. The oldest confirmed use of red ochre in a human context was not at a burial. It was at a tool-making site in South Africa called Blombos Cave. Over 100,000 years ago, people were grinding ochre into powder and storing it in abalone shells. They had ochre workshops. This means the red powder used in burials was not improvised. It was a known material with known uses. When someone chose to cover a burial in ochre, they were making a deliberate symbolic statement. They were saying, this person deserves what we put on sacred things. Now, some scientists argue that many of these early burials were accidental. The body happened to fall into a pit. Animals dragged it underground. A cave ceiling collapsed over the remains. These are fair objections. Archaeology is not always clean, but accumulating evidence across dozens of sites on multiple continents tells a consistent story. Ancient humans buried their dead on purpose, and they had been doing it for a very long time. But why does the location matter so much? Because burial sites weren't just about the dead. They were about the living, too. A grave is a marker. It says someone was here. It says this ground remembers. And the people who came back to that ground, season after season, generation after generation, they were not just visiting the dead. They were reminding themselves of who they were. The dead became anchors to the land. The first form of property wasn't a house or a field. It was a cemetery. A cemetery meant roots. It meant permanence. It meant home. Let's talk about the site that changed everything for archaeologists, a cave in northern Iraq called Shanidar. In the 1950s and 60s, a researcher named Ralph Solecki excavated the cave. He found something that made headlines around the world. The remains of a Neanderthal, not even fully modern humans, buried with flowers. The evidence was pollen. Massive clumps of flower pollen concentrated around the burial. Someone had placed bouquets of flowers over the body. The story was powerful. Even Neanderthals held funerals. Even our closest ancient relatives grieved. But then the story got complicated. More recent analysis suggested the pollen may have been brought in by burrowing rodents. Just an unfortunate tunnel through a flowery meadow. Not a funeral, just a very unlucky gopher. And yet the Shanidar Cave still held something remarkable. One of the Neanderthals, known as Shanidar I, was a middle-aged male. He had survived terrible injuries, a crushed leg, a withered arm, severe head trauma. He was essentially disabled in a world where you had to run to survive. He could barely walk, and yet he lived to old age. Someone fed him. Someone looked after him for years. Someone kept him alive when he should have been left behind. That tells you something about these people. It tells you they didn't simply abandon those who couldn't hunt. They cared, and caring for the living and caring for the dead are not separate things. They come from the same place. They come from the ability to see another person, not as an obstacle or a burden, as a person. The same impulse that made someone feed Shanidar I for years also made someone dig a hole and say, "You deserve better than this." Now, Neanderthals and modern humans buried their dead differently. Neanderthal burials tend to be simple. The body in a pit, occasionally with a single tool nearby. Modern human burials quickly become complex. Thousands of beads, ivory figurines, elaborate arrangements of flowers and animal bones. This difference tells us something profound about the gap between the two kinds of minds. Both groups understood that death was permanent, but modern humans did something different with that understanding. They turned grief into ceremony, and ceremony once started never really stops. Now let's go to Russia, a site called Sungir, about 180 miles east of Moscow. Around 30,000 years ago, well within the range of fully modern humans, 3 people were buried here. And the word buried doesn't capture it. They were adorned. A man was found covered in thousands of small ivory beads, over 3,000 of them, carved individually from mammoth tusk. Each bead would take approximately 45 minutes to produce. Do the math. That's over 2,000 hours of work just for the beads, not counting the burial itself, not counting any ceremony. 2 children were buried in the same grave, head to head. They were covered in more than 5,000 beads, plus Arctic fox teeth, ivory pendants, a carved mammoth figurine, and 2 astonishing ivory spears, nearly 8 feet long each. This wasn't a quick burial, this was an event, a massive communal investment of time, skill, and resources. Archaeologists have been arguing about ancient burial for more than a century. The debate is not just about whether these burials were intentional. It's about what they reveal about the minds that performed them. When you look at the Sungir burial, you have to ask a very direct question. Who organizes a community to spend 2,000 hours making beads for someone who is already dead? That takes social organization. It takes authority, shared values, and a common understanding of why this matters. These aren't just burials. These are organized religious and social events. And they tell us that ancient human society was far more organized than we often assume. For the dead, for people who would never hunt again, never speak again, never contribute anything practical to the group. Why would ancient humans do this? What were they thinking? What did they believe? There are several theories, and none of them are completely satisfying on their own. The first is the sanitation theory. Burying the dead keeps disease away. Bodies attract scavengers. Scavengers bring disease close to camp. Keeping the dead underground keeps the living safer. This is logical, clean and simple, and almost certainly wrong as the primary reason. Because if sanitation were the main driver, you wouldn't spend 2,000 hours making ivory beads. You wouldn't arrange flowers. You wouldn't place a seashell beside a child. Sanitation explains the hole in the ground. It doesn't explain anything else. The second theory involves territory and memory. A burial site marks a place. It says, "Our people were here. This ground belongs to us." The dead become anchors, physical evidence of ancestry and claim. Some anthropologists believe early burial practices were essentially land ownership. You don't just have a camp, you have a cemetery. And a cemetery means roots. It means permanence. It means we were here before you and we will be here after. This theory is compelling. It explains why ancient humans returned to the same burial sites repeatedly over generations, why they built monuments over the dead, why the great megalithic tombs of prehistoric Europe were built to be seen from miles away. These weren't hiding places, these were declarations. But this still doesn't fully explain the ochre, the beads, the grave goods, the tenderness. The third theory is the most interesting and the most human. Grief. Pure, simple, devastating grief. The same thing you feel when you lose someone you love. Ancient humans buried their dead because they missed them, because putting a body in the ground felt better than leaving it for wolves, because something in the human mind refuses to accept that the person is simply gone. This is called the theory of mortuary ritual as emotional processing, and there is strong evidence for it. When archaeologists find grave goods, they often find personal items, things the dead person used in life, a tool they favored, a piece of jewelry they wore, as if the living were equipping the dead for somewhere they were going, as if someone thought they might need this. That thought, they might need this, is one of the most profound things a mind can produce. It implies belief in continuity, belief that the person still exists somewhere, that death is a journey, not an ending. This is the beginning of religion. This is where it started. Not in temples, not in priesthoods, not in written doctrines handed down through generations. It started with someone digging a hole and trying to be kind to someone who would never know it. The burial impulse didn't stay in one place. It appeared independently across the entire inhabited world. Ancient burial sites have been found in Australia dating back over 40,000 years. The Lake Mungo site in New South Wales contains the oldest intentional cremation ever recorded. Cremation is burial in reverse, fire instead of earth. But the impulse is identical. You don't simply leave the body to disappear, you do something. In East Asia, ancient burial sites include elaborate jade grave goods and ritual vessels. In the Americas, ancient peoples buried their dead with food, tools, and paint, long before any contact with the old world. The same instinct, the same items, the same meaning, independent invention of the same sacred behavior on opposite ends of the earth. That is not a coincidence. That is human nature. The red ochre deserves its own mention. Red ochre, iron oxide mineral, appears in burials across Africa, Europe, and Asia for tens of thousands of years. Why red? Because red is the color of blood, of fire, of life. Covering a dead person in red ochre may have been a way of symbolically returning life to them, or preparing them for rebirth somewhere else. We don't know for certain. We can't know. The people who did it left no written explanation, but they did it consistently across vast distances for an extraordinary span of time. That consistency tells us something was profoundly important about this practice. Important enough to repeat across generations, across continents, across thousands of years. And then there are the grave goods that seem to prepare the dead for what comes next. Food left in pots, weapons placed beside warriors, beloved objects buried alongside their owners. All of this points to a single stunning belief, that wherever the dead were going, they would need things. That death was not an ending, but a departure. This idea, so simple, so consoling, so impossible to prove or disprove, became the foundation of every major belief system in human history. You can draw a straight line from a 74,000-year-old child buried with a seashell to every cathedral, mosque, and temple ever built. The buildings changed. The impulse never did. No other animal on Earth has ever shown evidence of this belief. Ravens will stay near their dead. Elephants will touch the bones of those who came before. Chimpanzees have been observed guarding the bodies of dead companions for days. But none of them bury. None of them prepare the dead for a journey. None of them place a necklace on a child they loved and then say goodbye. Only we do that. And we have been doing it for longer than our species has any other cultural tradition we know of. Burial may be the oldest ritual in human history. It may be the foundation on which everything else was built. Art, music, story, religion, law, all of it may trace back to that first quiet act of digging a hole. Here's what burial tells us about ancient human cognition. It tells us they understood death. Not just feared it, understood it. An animal runs from a predator out of instinct, but a human who buries their dead has grasped something far more abstract. They understand that the person who was there is now gone, that this state is permanent, that it will happen to everyone, including themselves. That thought, it will happen to me, is one of the most terrifying things a mind can hold. There is something else worth noting before we close. Every burial is a small act of rebellion against time. Time erases everything. Bones dissolve, memory fades, Names are forgotten. But a deliberate burial says, not yet, not this one. This one we will mark. This one we will remember, for as long as we can. And for 100,000 years, we have been keeping that promise. So why did ancient humans start burying their dead? The honest answer is, probably all of those reasons at once. Sanitation played a role. Territory played a role. Grief played the biggest role of all. But underneath all of it is something that makes humans different from every other animal. We know we're going to die, we've always known it, and we've always refused to accept it as the final word. The ancient human who dug that first deliberate grave wasn't performing a ritual. They were doing something simpler and more profound. They were refusing to let someone simply disappear. They were saying, you were here, you were real, and I will not pretend otherwise. 100,000 years later, we're still doing the exact same thing. If you found this worth your time, let me know in the comments what aspect of ancient human life you want to explore next. Subscribe if you want more. I'll see you in the next one.